Hi, I'm Amy Cardoso and welcome to Art This Week. On this week's episode, we visit the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, and our interviewer, Linda Mowl, speaks with curator Alison de Lima Greene about the exhibition Ron Mueck. Now for Art This Week.
Hi, I'm Linda Mowl, and today I'm at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, speaking with Alison de Lima Greene about the exhibition Ron Mueck. Alison, thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you for coming here.
So this exhibition features 13 of Ron Mueck's works, which is actually a really large grouping for this sculptor. Can you tell me a little bit about the significance of an exhibition this size?
Ron Mueck came to sculpture late. He began his career actually in film and television as a model maker. And if you ever saw Labyrinth, you've seen Ron Mueck's work. He plays one of the great monster figures in that fantasy film starring David Bowie. But he cast off his guise as a monster and began making sculpture when he was about 40 years old, when he was living in London, and this was in 1996. And his very first figure was a Pinocchio figure that he made for his mother-in-law, who was a painter, who commissioned it for him to go with, or be a model for, I should say, a group of paintings she was doing on the theme of Pinocchio. And within a year, by 1997, he made a full-time commitment to being a sculptor. But because his work is so demanding, every detail is worked by hand with enormous care. Over the 20 or so years since 1997, he's only produced 39 sculptures. And so we have a third of his entire production on view here in Houston.
So Alison, how did you arrange the show?
One of the things we decided early on, and this was in conversation with the artist studio, was not to try to do a chronological installation. Typically when you do a retrospective of an artist, you say, here's his early work, mid-career, her later work, depending. And with Mueck, there is an evolution. I'm not going to deny that. But we wanted to sort of set up telling juxtapositions. We wanted to go through a sort of gradual enlarging in scale, diminishing, enlarging, and sort of breathing in and out. And it was very important to me that we end with a girl, so that when you leave the show, the last thing you see is a newborn infant, which suggests, of course, a beginning. And my ideal visitor walks through the exhibition and then turns around and walks through it 3 more times. Or comes back 4 or 5 times. When I gave a tour last night, someone told me it was their 9th visit to the show.
And they also really do fill the galleries. We'll talk a little more about specifics in a moment, but these sculptures do sort of demand a little bit of space around them. So it doesn't feel like a sparsely populated exhibition by any means.
No, sculpture always takes more space than you think. And not only does it command the gallery it's in, and we're sitting in front of 2 very large-scale figures, but sculpture invites you to walk around it. And in an era when we look at so much art, first on a tablet, an iPhone, a computer screen, we're very familiar with walking up to a painting, meeting it, if you will, gazing at it, and walking away. Well, with sculpture, of course, it's in the middle of the room, and in most instances, it's best revealed when you walk around it. It's a different kind of physical conversation.
These sculptures, they sort of have a wealth of information to them. I mean, one of the things that's a hallmark of Ron Mueck's work is hyperrealism. Obviously, he plays with scale, but in many ways, they don't reveal themselves for what they are, and so they really invite that investigation and that interaction. Absolutely,
and there's always a telling gesture in Mueck's work. For example, there's a young couple in another gallery where from the front They seem slightly awkward and shy, the way a lot of adolescent couples are. and she's sort of leaning towards him. They're both very casually dressed. But when you walk around the back, you'll see that he's holding her hand very strongly. It's like this kid hasn't learned how to hold hands yet. And he's holding her hand so hard that he's hitting the tendon that, you know, your hand goes like this when you hit the tendon here, and her hand has that reaction.
Right.
So that's a sort of nice reveal when you walk around that sculpture. We have another sculpture in the show called Mask #2. It's one of a series of mask images, and you see the artist's face. It's a self-portrait lying on a pedestal. It's just the head, and you know, very soft and squishy. And so it has that realism, not just of detail, but the sense of weight that a body has. But when you walk around it, you see it's hollow from behind, like a mask is. So there's all sorts of plays with realities that he engages in, so that, like a real mask, it's hollow, but no real mask sags the way human flesh does.
Exactly.
And so the sculpture has the qualities of human flesh artificially rendered. And so there's that gamesmanship always with Mueck that invites you to think. But it really does invite that kind of gazing, that kind of contemplation, what I would call a second glance.
Well, one of the things about his work that often does require a second glance is this question of materials and how it's made. And a lot of people are curious about the process because the process doesn't reveal itself, and the artist hand is so expert that you can't see it. Can you speak a little bit about what the process is for making these objects?
Certainly, and one of the things we do have for our visitors is a marvelous documentary film made by Gauthier de Blonde, who worked very closely with Mueck for a number of years, photographing and filming the artist in his studio. And Mueck really works in a very classical manner. He may refer to photographs for details, but typically he really works step by step in the old-fashioned way of making a very small model out of clay to sort of refine the sort of positioning of the figures. He then makes a larger model, sometimes more than one in clay, and when it gets to the level of finish he wants, he then makes a mold around the clay model, and then the actual sculptures are made from acrylic and silicone that are then colored by hand. Each hair is placed individually. The clothing is made. So, and that presents its own challenge. For example, with the small sculptures, he has to find fabric that has a tight enough weave so that actually when you look at a figure wearing denim jeans, if you had real denim, it would look too big.
Exactly. I never would have thought of
and
that,
so
but you're
he actually
completely right.
uses chambray instead, and the studio assistant told me you have to be very careful about what shirt you wear to Mueck studio
Because you might cut it up.
Exactly. You might say, that's the weave I'm looking for.
And also with that scale, other problems, not just the clothing, but I was noticing this woman was shopping. All of the things in her bag are miniaturized to the correct scale for her miniature body.
Yes.
And the materials there, I also think about the bag itself can't be made of the material bags are made of, because over time the weight of the fake shopping would...
Yes. Well, sometimes he'll use the plastic and it'll be replaced, but typically everything is carefully fabricated. The umbrella behind us, for example, was made by his studio assistant, Charlie Clark. It's not something that you just run over to Target and pick up, but he makes it look like it was something you could pick up at Target.
Right.
And actually, he did try on occasion to use found material if there was a shortcut like doll's clothes or, something miniaturized. But usually he found that they were either not well enough made or they were never quite the right scale. So the found material always looked out of sync with the actual sculpture. There's one exception in this show. There's a beautiful sculpture called Man in a Boat, and that actually is a real boat, and one that's very weathered. And the juxtaposition of the very lonely, somewhat anxious-looking figure in this rough boat is, I think, one of the most poignant images in the show.
I would absolutely agree. And I think that I see Ron Mueck playing with scale sometimes to be playful, but more often to have that poignant effect, this introspective figure, a lot of times very vulnerable. And the man in the boat is a rare exception, I think, where the boat is the normal scale and the figure is smaller, and that it does kind of put you off center when you look at it, and it makes his smallness something about him personally rather than the physical state of being.
Well, also I think, it creates a visual distance. No matter how close you get to the figure, he seems far away. And to protect the sculptures, we do have sort of lines of demarcation on the floor because there is something about this realism that you just see people's hands going forward to touch. You're like, no.
Right.
Your fingerprints actually can hurt the sculpture.
Right.
But the question of scale is one that he's thought about very carefully. Ron Mueck almost never makes public statements. He thinks his sculpture speaks for itself, and I would agree. We find that there's one great comment, though, he gave in an interview a number of years ago, which is, we meet people our own size every day.
Right.
Exactly.
I've read that quote and I loved it. I agree. It's
and so,
fascinating.
Pushing it into the realm of art comes from that shift in scale. And also I think he wanted to distinguish his work from artists like Dwayne Hansen or John DeAndrea, sculptors who also work in a very hyper-realistic manner, who are perhaps less familiar now, but you would see their work often in the 80s and 90s when Mueck was coming of age.
Also, a phrase that keeps coming to my mind is the phrase expressive distortion, which in the art world means something very different. But when you're dealing with such hyper-realistic sculpture, maybe this is Mueck's way of doing expressive distortion. He's using the scale distortion as a way to express something.
Absolutely, Linda, that's exactly you hit the nose. You hit it on the nose. Yeah, I think we often think of expressionism as being painterliness or exaggerated form. And there is exaggerated form, but it's not about our usual ideas of distortion.
Right. And in some ways, the level of realism seems like an exaggeration. In the sculpture behind us right now, there's like dead skin under the toenails. I mean, it's so detailed it seems excessive. It's like no one could be that specific.
One of the things that Charlie Clark pointed out to me is that the hair on all these figures is nylon.
Right.
And what they do is they seek out different widths so that if you're making a large sculpture, you need fatter hair. If you're making small sculpture, you need finer hair. And that, every detail matters. That's why the production is so small across the career, but also why every sculpture is so powerful.
I wanted to talk briefly about one of the ways Ron Mueck got his start, which was the exhibition Sensation, which was the second major work that was featured, but it definitely sort of rocketed him to fame. That the main sculpture in question for this exhibition would be the sculpture Dead Dad. And I wanted to talk about the emotional aspect of this work.
It's interesting. Before Mueck did Dead Dad, he did the Pinocchio sculpture, and actually for some of his commercial work, he had done a number of babies. And so he begins his career with sort of extreme youth, and then he makes a tribute to his father, who had died in Melbourne, which is where Mueck had grown up. And of course, Mueck never saw his father dead. He was halfway across the world. And in tribute to his father, And I think in ways of coming to terms with his feelings about his father's death, he makes a sculpture that was commissioned by Charles Saatchi. And Saatchi basically had come to Mueck after seeing the Pinocchio figure and said, I would like to support your career, I would like to commission a sculpture. He didn't give him any instructions beyond that. And Mueck created his father laid out in death as if he was on a mortuary slab. Every detail is hyper-real. The figure is nude, which is shocking to some. But the greater shock, of course, is that it's less than half size. And so when you see photographs of dead dad, you might assume that it's life size, but that wild, sudden shift in scale was very important. And again, I think expresses in part Mueck's own distance from his father and that separation between life and death that work expresses. Of course, the other thing that's important about Dead Dad is if you've studied the history of art, or if you are familiar with the iconography of Christianity, there is perhaps an inescapable reference to the dead Christ. And a powerful image that Renaissance artists like Mantegna and Dürer painted on all the way down to the 19th century and even into our own times. And there's also figures of dead figures that are not necessarily in Christian imagery. But Mueck always was fascinated with the history of art. And actually, in the early 2000s, he had a particular distinction in being invited to the National Gallery in London to be their resident fellow. And while there, that was an opportunity to visit the museum any time of day or night. He had an atelier there. He had access to their libraries, their archives, their curators, to really immerse himself in this magnificent collection and to think about the themes that had spanned more than a millennium of Western culture. And Dead Dad preceded that experience, but you will see in our show, such as 2 images of mother and children, that the idea of the Madonna is revisited in sometimes very radical ways. Images that may call up connotations of the crucifixion are suggested, even of the resurrection. I'll leave it to our visitors to discover these, but there is a young man, for example, who raises his shirt to reveal a stab wound. And since the figure is Afro-American or Anglo-African, your first thought might be it's a victim of gang violence or of other forms of brutality. But also the wound is the same position as the wound of Christ. And you could think of the parable of Christ and doubting Thomas, when after the resurrection, Christ revealed himself by revealing his wound. Not that Mueck wants to limit this to Christian imagery, but he touches on these themes because they are the timeless and eternal ways that Western civilization has found to explore these very big themes that surround life and death.
Additionally, I think that as much as the materials sort of suggest a modernity, it's all portraiture in its way, and that's arguably the oldest genre there is. So he does draw on this really rich tradition.
It's portraiture, it's still life, it's, I would say, even genre painting. There's only one portrait in the show, which is his self-portrait. And A Woman Was Shopping was inspired by a brief glimpse he caught of a woman on a street corner with a baby in a snuggly, 2 shopping bags. We joke that this is the most exhausted woman on the planet.
And she looks it.
But she Most of the works are crafted, so that you don't have too limited a reaction to it. We see two old women gossiping. Many of us have known old women who gossip, whether or not they look like our aunts or grandmothers, but we recognize the gesture and the pose. I love the figures we're sitting in front of, and it interests me that some people see these as a couple who are very loving and so intimate that they don't have to show their intimacy.
Right.
When you really know someone, if you've been together for many years, as is suggested by the older couple under an umbrella, you don't always have to smile at each other. You can be bored together. You can be exhausted together. But what I found very touching was I took some friends of mine through the show who themselves have been married more than 40 years. They were sitting on one of the benches, and I looked over, and I think completely unconsciously, the man had reached over to his wife and was holding her arm in almost the same gesture. And as I walk around the show, I often see the public mimicking the gestures of the figures and not even being conscious of it. Not that people are lifting their shirts, but when you see someone with crossed arms, you tend to cross your arms as well.
Right, and perhaps because of their hyperrealism, we interact with them similar to a human. We mimic gesture in the behavioral psychology sort of way we interact with humans.
And also, at least I'm sort of shy. I find it very hard to look too closely at someone. It seems an invasion of privacy. And so I'm surprised sometimes what people say, like we have a marvelous sculpture of a newborn infant that is many, many times life-size. And someone said, oh, newborn babies don't have perfect toenails. And I'm like, well, actually, newborn babies do. They get old and scabby like this, at the end of life, but there's something quite perfect about an infant's toenails at the point of birth, which Mueck, as a father, he's was in the birthing room when both his daughters were born, knows firsthand. And he conveys that information, even though very few of us have the opportunity to witness a birth. And as with Dead Dad, very few of us also ever witness a death or see a body after death.
Well, to me, that's one of Mueck's greatest strengths. I mean, there's this obvious technical hand coordination that he's able to do this with his hand, but also it's this power of observation. It's the fact that he would notice these details at all that a lot of people, myself included, overlook. And until someone blows it up, you say, oh, babies do have perfect toenails.
Yes.
And he just noticed.
And I think he's also a storyteller. And so every time he observes a detail and chooses to use it in his sculpture, it's to further our empathy with the figure, to deepen our understanding, to provoke our own memories. And one of the things I often say about Mueck's work is that essentially he's a very generous artist. The generosity is in the way you can approach his sculpture so easily. They speak to many audiences, and he most often keeps to his own personal experience. He doesn't try to illustrate everyone from around the world. It's the urban environment or the vacationing environment that he grew up in and experiences. But he always goes from the very particular to enough of the general that we can recognize ourselves in each and every sculpture.
Well, the exhibition's through August 13th, right?
That's correct.
Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today.
Linda, you and your crew are so kind to be here. Welcome to Houston.
Thank you so much.
We want to thank Alison for speaking with us. For more information on the exhibition, go to mfah.org. That's it for Art This Week. Thanks for watching.
I still got your Polaroid.